So great to see you today. Just want to say welcome to our online community. And I want to give a quick shout out to all the guys at Liberty Correctional. Would you give it up for our Liberty Correctional campus? We love you guys. Had the honor of worshiping with them this past week. And man, it's just such an amazing experience to be with them. And I just want to brag on our team. Man, they are doing such an amazing job under the leadership of Michael Ball. And it's so awesome as a pastor to watch people step into their gifting and God use them. It really, if you've ever wondered, like, what am I passionate about? Yes, Jesus is part of that. But I think the bigger passion is watching people step into the fulfillment of God's promise and purpose for their life. And man, you talk about just impact that your generosity is making in men's lives. And so I want to thank you for your partnership with that. Sometimes in my life, tell me if you can kind of relate to this, but sometimes in my life, God just has a tendency to feel a little bit more distant than normal. Like, it's not like I've done anything majorly wrong, still going to church, still believing the right things, but there's just something just feels off. Like, have you ever felt that way? You're still leaning in, you're still trying to trust God, still trying to do the right things, but it's just something just tends to feel off with your relationship with Him. And I think the frustrating thing about those feelings, those seasons in our life is that it would be one thing if we knew what it was. It'd be one thing if we did something like majorly wrong that we could put our finger on and identify what it is and repent for it and reset in our life and begin to move forward again. But sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes it's hard for us to gauge why we feel so disconnected, why it feels like God is silent in our life in a typical or season. And so my question that I want to kind of lead with today is what do we do in those seasons? What do we do in the seasons when God feels distant, but the reason why He feels distant isn't that obvious? That's a tension that we find in life. It's not just a tension that is experienced in faith. It's a tension, if you like baseball, it's a tension that Major League Baseball players experience when they're in a hitting slump and they're having difficulty being able to make contact with the ball. It's not like they forgot how to swing the bat. It's just something in their swing mechanics gets a little off. And the crazy thing about that is their swing still feels normal. It feels like the same swing that they have been doing, but the results are different. Like, their confidence begins to drop. They start to get frustrated, start kind of pressing a little bit, second guessing what they're doing. And what most players will tell you is that the only way that they can get out of the slump is to have a coach slow them down enough to be able to point out something small, something that's in their swing that's throwing the entire thing off. One small adjustment can take what feels off and make it feel right again. And in Luke chapter 6, Jesus is doing the same thing for us. He's essentially a coach that's trying to help us in our spiritual lives be able to identify what that little thing, that small adjustment that needs to be made in order for our relationship with God to feel right again. And what he does in Luke chapter 6 that we're going to look at today is he slows us down just a little bit to show us what's throwing things off. We've been in a series that we've entitled Kingdom Paradox. This week we're in week 6 of that series. And it's a series where Jesus is challenging our assumptions about God, our assumptions about life, our assumptions about eternity. And today I've entitled the message, The Paradox of Fairness. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like to get even in the kingdom of God. A perfect message leading into the holidays. We're going to be in Luke chapter 6 today. If you got your Bibles, turn with me to verse 27. We'll go there in just a second. But what we're seeing here in Luke chapter 6 reminds me of what oftentimes happens around Christmas time or the holidays. You have the extended family, right? Everybody's kind of coming into town, and the family gathers. And as everybody is hanging out in the common areas together, somebody in the family says something that is completely out of left field, and the whole room kind of freezes. Like, it's one of those moments where it's said, it happens, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, are we going to address what was just said, or are we going to pretend that it never happened? And that tension is kind of what we're stepping into in Luke chapter 6. You see, in Luke 6, Jesus has just selected his disciples, and his disciples, think of them kind of like rookies at the time. They're just trying to figure out what does following Jesus look like? What does kingdom living actually look like? And so they come down off of a mountain, and as they come down off the mountain, this crowd begins to gather, and it's all of these people who are sick, and they're wanting Jesus to heal them. And Jesus has this kind of semi-private moment. I want you to imagine, this massive crowd, and Jesus has got his disciples here. And it's one of those scenes where what Jesus is saying to the disciples, kind of like some people in the crowd can overhear it, but not everybody. And so Jesus says some things to the disciples, and then in verse 27, with the disciples there, he then begins to speak and address the crowd, and the disciples are part of that. And here's what Jesus says in verse 27. He says, "But to you who are listening." In other words, there's a choice. We could choose to heed what Jesus is about to say or not. And he says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." Now, this lands a little different for us because for most of us here, we don't really have this kind of enemy. We've got some people that have wronged us in life, but he's speaking about the Romans. He's speaking about the people that are persecuting the followers of Jesus, the people that are controlling their lives. And Jesus uses this word love, and what's interesting is there's five words that Jesus could have used that meant love in this moment, but he chose to use the word agape. The reason why that word agape is significant is because it's the same word that was used out of John chapter 3, verse 16, that says, "So God so loved the world that he gave his only son." It's that agape love. Agape love is a love that's not a feeling, it's a choice. Like whether we feel like loving somebody or not, we choose to love them. And he's having this moment where he's talking to them about the importance of choosing to love our enemies, the people that do us wrong in life. And he says in verse 28, and I think this is kind of funny. He says, "Bless those who curse you and pray for those who mistreat you." And here's why I think that's funny, is because I wonder if Jesus understood how that would come across in the American South. Like, because if you're from the north or the west coast or whatever, you don't get it. You don't get it. But if you're from the south, you understand that bless your heart means something completely different in the south, right? In the south, like, bless their heart is not a blessing at all. It's a diagnosis, right? Like, something's wrong with this person. Bless their heart. And then the whole pray part, like pray for you. Like in the South, that's not a compassionate, command of praying for somebody. In the South, it's like a spiritual restraining order. It lands different. And then you see the next verse, and then you kind of think, well, maybe Jesus did understand what it might mean, because in the next verse 27, he's like, listen, if anybody slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. And then he says, if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. I mean, in all seriousness, in this moment, we have to understand something about what Jesus is kind of leaning into here. We have to understand what he's not saying and what he is saying. He's not saying here in this part that we've got to tolerate abuse. What he's saying here in verse 29 is he's addressing how you and I respond to offense in our life, how we respond to disrespect, how we respond to insults or when people betray us. And he says in verse 30, like with all that in mind, he says, I want you to give to everyone who asks you. Like he's tagging this to the idea of enemies and people that do you wrong. He's like, give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. He says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. I mean, it's crazy stuff, right? It's the uncle that says the weirdest thing in the room, and everybody's like, what are we doing about this? And so up to this point, Jesus has been telling us how to respond to people that have wronged us. But then it's almost like Jesus hits the pause button and he says, all right, now let's be honest for just a second. And he says this in verse 32, he says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And then he says something to me that seemed kind of out of place until you understand the culture. He says in verse 34, and if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. Now, it's important for us to understand that in that culture, most relationships were transactional. Like everything you did had strings attached to it. And so what Jesus is getting at here isn't just about like just giving away a bunch of free money. What he's getting at here is the motivation. He's saying that, listen, if we're gonna love people, if we're gonna help people, if we're gonna give to people, but we only do it when it benefits us, he's like, that's not kingdom. And then he summarizes these last 8 verses. He summarizes it in verse 35. He says, but love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Again, understand, he's talking about motivation here. So when church is over, don't start going around to people asking them for money and not expecting to have to pay it back. He's talking about our motivations. And Jesus says that when we have those kind of kingdom motivations in our heart, then there's a reward, and that reward is going to be great. Now, yes, we have an eternal reward. I think that's part of what Jesus is talking about. But what I want to propose to you today is that reward isn't just eternal. There's also a reward that we experience here, and it's a reward that has nothing to do with money. He says that you're going to be children of the Most High when you respond that way to people that have done you wrong, because, and he says this is why, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And then Jesus helps us see the heart posture that we need in order to live this way. In the next verse, he says, to be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. See, mercy is an interesting word. Mercy means that we don't get what we deserve to get. It means that when we make a mistake, when we do something wrong, we deserve the punishment for that. But mercy is like I'm not going to extend that to you. And so Jesus is saying that the motivation, the way that we're able to, the heart posture that allows us to be able to live this way towards those who have done us wrong, that motivation becomes mercy. That it's, in our world, we want to get even. In our world, we give back because they gave it to us. And what Jesus is saying is that in the kingdom, it's different. In the kingdom, we don't give back what they deserve. You see, he's not talking about this feeling sorry for people here. He's talking about us choosing mercy when judgment is deserved and would be much easier. And how do we do that? We do that by remembering that God did that for us. That he extended us mercy. Not a single one of us in this room deserve the life that we're living. We may not have a perfect life. There may be a lot of things that we're navigating in life, but we're still way better than we deserve to be. And what Jesus is getting at is that what God has done for us in the kingdom, we do for others. And then Jesus, he makes this shift, and the shift no longer is about what happens to us, but now it's about what begins to flow out of us. He says in verse 37, do not judge, and you'll not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Now, this is a verse that is often misunderstood. It's misunderstood to assume that Jesus is making a threat here. That he's essentially, this statement is all about punishment, that if we do something wrong, right, if we judge somebody, then God's going to judge us. And if we don't forgive everybody in our life, then God's not going to forgive us. And at the end of the day, if that was the reality, it would be a burden that you and I would be impossible for us to carry. Impossible. You see, Jesus here is, the expectation is not perfection. What Jesus is trying to articulate in that verse is he's trying to describe how relationships work. How relationships work with God, how they work with people. You see, what Jesus is saying here is that the life that we experience, that it's shaped by the heart posture that we choose. I think it goes all the way back to that verse 27 where Jesus is throwing out this choice, like to those of you who are listening. He's like, listen, I want you to understand that the kind of life that you experience is shaped by the heart posture that you choose, the way that you treat not the people that are already in your corner cheering you on, but the people that aren't. And this is where we have to zoom out just a little bit for a moment, because Jesus now has contrasted two very different types of kingdoms. The kingdom of this world, which is what all of us struggle with. I'm not standing up here preaching this because I'm perfect in it. The reality is the kingdom of this world is one that's quick to judge. It's one that's quick to condemn people. It's slow to forgive. Have you ever noticed that we want people to forgive us quickly, but we're not so quick to forgive them? It's a world that holds on to grudges, all about getting even. It's a world that withholds generosity. And here's the challenge, is that all of that feels fair. It even feels at times when we've been wronged in our life, it feels justified. But what Jesus is trying to expose here is what is beneath the surface of that kind of living. What Jesus is trying to help us see is that kind of living, that it slowly shrinks our soul. And that's why Jesus contrasted it with what the kingdom of God looks like, which is one that's slow to judge. It's one that's quick to forgive. It's one that's overflowing with mercy towards others. It's one of radical generosity. It's one that is trusting God with justice in our life. And that's the paradox. Because that way of living feels unnatural. It's against our instinct. It often doesn't even feel fair. Right? When people are constantly doing wrong things against us and trying to tear us down, it doesn't feel fair to extend forgiveness, to trust God to get even. But what Jesus is trying to help us understand is this bigger picture of what's happening under the surface if we choose to live the way of the world. And he says in verse 38, and this is a verse you've probably read before, but I want to make sure that we understand it in proper context. It's been used in the past as a money verse. It can be a money verse, but it applies to every area of our life. And notice the things that Jesus has been talking about leading up to this verse. He's been talking about the way that we treat others. He's been talking about our heart posture. He's been talking about people that do us wrong and how we're going to treat them. And it all leads up to this statement. He says, give, and it'll be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. That it will be poured into your lap, for the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now let me unpack this for just a second. In the first century marketplace, they would walk up with their robes and to get a grain or whatever it was, and oftentimes they would flip up their robe, and the person that was selling the grain, if they were dishonest, then they would fill that container or whatever it was they were using to hold that, they would fill it quickly in such a way that there would be air pockets on the inside so that it would be perceived as having a lot when it really wasn't. The honest sellers would pour in, and they would begin to press in order to get the air pockets out so that they could keep pouring in. They would shake it in order to get it to settle, all so that they could make room for more. And so Jesus is using that, what they are used to in the marketplace, something that they're doing often in their life, and he's using that as a way to describe the posture of the heart and what it does in us when we choose the way of the world instead of the way of the kingdom. And he says this statement at the end, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That word measure, in the way that they would have received it in their context, is it was a measurement tool. And essentially what Jesus is trying to help them understand is that our measurement, it doesn't determine God's love for us, right? We're talking about those seasons when we can't put our finger on it. We feel distant from God, but we don't quite know what it is. And he's saying here that our measure, that it doesn't determine how much of God's love or his mercy or his grace that he's extending to us. What it does is it determines our capacity to experience it. Let me explain it this way. What Jesus is trying to get at here is that in our life and the way that we treat other people, especially the people that do us wrong, that if we have a small measurement tool of grace and of mercy that we extend to people that do us wrong, of forgiveness, then this is the measurement tool that we are stuck with vertically when it comes to our relationship with God. What we give is what we receive. He's saying if you increase that a little bit and you give a little bit more of forgiveness to other people, then you get a little bit more of, it's not a transactional thing, okay? It's not that God's supply changes. It's that our capacity to receive it does. It's not that God decides not to give us love, not to extend mercy, not to extend grace because we've been living that way. It's because the measurement tool that we have to receive it can't hold it. And so what Jesus is trying to help them understand is that how they live their life, like maybe they're not out there doing a bunch of things that we would deem in our society wrong or sinful, but the way that they're allowing the things to run through their mind when people do them wrong, and holding grudges and side-eyeing and talking about them to other people behind their back. What he's trying to help them understand is that it reduces the measurement tool in their life. That if they're not going to extend that kind of godly grace, then they're not going to be able to receive it. And so it begins to bog down, to block our heart from being able to receive all that God has for us in our life. See, most of us don't feel far from God because we stopped believing in God. We feel far from God because something in our life has gradually, over time, started closing our heart to receive it. You see, when we're judgmental in our life towards others, it creates distance. Not just, remember, this is about relationships with others and with God. That it doesn't just create distance with others, but it creates distance with God. When we start replaying those conversations over and over in our mind, and we begin to assign motives for what they said. We begin to read into the intent of their heart based upon the tone of their voice. Then what happens to us is we have this small measurement to receive in it, and it's hard for us to feel God's grace in our life when we're not willing to extend grace to others. Like condemnation. When we're attacking other people's identity rather than discerning their behavior, it hardens our heart. When we begin to pronounce verdicts on them for what they've done. Bitterness in our life. Bitterness is the result of holding on to hurt, not letting it go and not forgiving. That blocks our intimacy with God. I mean, we can still sing the songs and we can still pray. We can still believe all the right things, but our heart becomes clenched. Not because God is pulling away from us, but because our heart is closed off. You see, what I've kind of learned in my own journey of making right choices and making wrong choices is that tight-fisted living, that it creates tight-fisted spirituality. That when I'm going to live this way, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's how I treat people, holding on to the grace and holding on to the mercy, not releasing it, then it leads to a tight-fisted relationship with God. And what that does over time is it results in cynicism, where we're always expecting the worst from that person. It reduces our compassion. It causes us to get frustrated quickly, to get irritated. Emotionally, we begin to get numb, spiritual dryness. All of those things, not because God has moved away, but because our heart has closed off. And so what does it look like for us practically to kind of enlarge that capacity again so that we can begin to identify those little adjustments in our life in order to fix our spiritual swing? I think the first one is this: we've got to release judgment. We've got to release it. This week, when you catch yourself assuming motives, pause for a minute and remind yourself that you don't know the whole story. I've learned in my life that if I will not jump to conclusions and I will recognize that I have no idea what this person has experienced 30 minutes before my encounter with them. I have no idea what the weight is that they are carrying in their own life. That when I began to extend that kind of grace, that it begins to open my heart up. I think we've got to replace condemnation with mercy. Mercy doesn't mean that we approve of somebody's behavior. It just means that we believe that God's not finished with them yet. We got to choose forgiveness before the feeling comes. If you wait until you feel like forgiving somebody, it ain't happening, I'm telling you. It ain't happening. It's forgiveness is a choice. It's not a feeling. And when you do that, when you forgive somebody, you're not telling them that what they did was okay. What you're what you're doing is you're refusing to let what they did keep your heart closed. We got to practice kingdom generosity. Not with just money, but with patience, with kindness, giving people the benefit of the doubt. And then one more, we got to trust God with justice. Listen, our job is obedience. His job is the outcome. So we got to let God handle what is above our pay grade in the spiritual world. We got to stop trying to change people and start changing our measurement tool. Because friend, when our measurement tool changes, our experience with God changes. Know this, that if we live our life the world's way, and we treat people the way that we think is fair because this is the way they treated you, so this is the way you're going to treat them back. If we live our life that way, it closes down our heart. It reduces our capacity to receive from God. But when we live God's way, use God's measurement tool, it opens our heart. So what Jesus is trying to help us see here is the kingdom paradox of fairness. That what feels fair to you and I in the moment, that ultimately it's going to cost us what's best in the end.
Thank you so much for tuning in with us. If you enjoyed today's message, go ahead and subscribe because there's content like this every single week. And if it spoke to you in any way, make sure you share it with a friend because you never know whose life you can change with just one simple share. Listen, we hope to see your face in the place this Sunday. Go ahead and check out our website for our service times at transformtlh.com, and we hope to see you soon.